Welcome back to Dead Reckoning, the Human Life Expectancy channel. Having explored the ethical issues relating to technologies that revolutionize human reproduction in our last video, in this video we'll explore key issues relating to genetic engineering. Specifically, do we have the right to change other species? And do we have the right to change the human genome? To address these questions, we will once again draw upon our views expressed in the Ethical Perspectives video, so check that one out if you haven't seen it yet. So, do we have the right to change other species? To start, let's recognize that there's nothing particularly moral about evolution in nature, so the ethical standard for changing other species should perhaps not be very high. Individuals die and species go extinct quite independent of the amount of good they do while they're alive, or the amount of suffering they experience or inflict upon others. Kevin Esvelt, the leader of the Sculpting Evolution group at MIT, has raised ethical objections to evolution. He noted, quote, "The apparent total indifference to animal suffering, to any notion of right and wrong. Evolution is immoral. I'm not saying it's immoral because it's a physical process, but the fact that it does not care about or optimize well-being I view as a fundamental flaw in the universe." Nicely said, Kevin. There are many indications that we think we do have the right to change other species. For some, it may follow from the Old Testament, Genesis 1:26. "Let us make man in our image, and let them have dominion over the fish in the sea, and over the fowl in the air, and over the cattle, and all over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." The ethical perspective of humans first also supports our right to change animals. As we noted in our video, Can We Control Evolution? We've been breeding, killing, and eating plants and animals for over 20,000 years to meet our needs, and most now bear little resemblance to their natural ancestors. Globally, we slaughter about 77 billion chickens, ducks, pigs, turkey, sheep, and cattle a year, not including fish. See our New Food Technologies video for more on that. And killing an animal must be regarded as a greater ethical crime than modifying its genes. In fact, human-bred and genetically modified organisms currently serve humans in many ways. GMO foods and livestock allow us to feed humans that would otherwise have lower life expectancies or even starve. Genetically modified animals, including rats, mice, worms, and many other species, are very helpful in medical research so that we can accelerate the discovery of life-extending treatments. Genetically modified animals are directly involved in life-extending medical treatments. Genetically modified organisms also create products to benefit humans. In addition to the genetically modified plants and animals in our food supply, genetically modified bacteria are now being used in bioremediation, where the bacteria are used to convert pollutants such as crude oil, carbon, and other toxic waste into less toxic forms, and also used as sensors that express a fluorescent protein under certain environmental conditions, and genetically modified algae is used to produce biofuels. Ethical constraints must be weighed against these sizable benefits. Even more extreme, we've driven many thousands of species extinct. While no one would regard this as a shining example of ethical behavior, we have clearly allowed it to happen. And compared to extinction, genetic modifications must be regarded as a lesser ethical crime, if a crime at all. Finally, the evolution exists and doesn't stop, and the technology serves life and doesn't stop evolving perspective suggests that it would be unethical to stop evolving other animals and potentially difficult to stop even if we wanted to do so. However, the imperative responsibility perspective says that we have an ethical duty to respond to the needs of other species, and the proportionality perspective says that there should be more ethical constraints on changing more animals. As one common sense result, this means that we should be more careful about changing entire species, for example by editing germline cells, than we would be about changing an individual, for example by editing an individual's somatic cells. So, given that we've bred hundreds of species to meet our needs for thousands of years, we slaughter billions of creatures each year to feed ourselves, and have caused the extinction of thousands of species without significant ethical strife, it's hard to argue that genetic engineering or other species should now trigger that strife. But what about humans? Do we have the right to modify the human genome? The humans first perspective suggests that the ethical hurdles for modifying humans would be greater than for other animals, given our species-specific bias. However, the other core perspectives support that it is ethical to use genetic engineering on humans in many circumstances. The evolution exists and doesn't stop perspective suggests that Homo sapiens is not the endpoint of evolution, and it would be immoral, and in all likelihood ineffective, to try to stop our species from evolving further. Those who would oppose genetic engineering on these grounds are essentially arguing that there is a certain correct genetic heritage for humanity, that is, our current one, and the populace should have no choice in this matter. Philosophers call this mistaken notion that the current natural forms of species are somehow best and cannot be improved the naturalistic fallacy. Any government or entity attempting to perpetuate our current form would be taking the audacious and dysfunctional position that human evolution should stop, and that they are in the best position to decide our current form is optimal for all humanity for all time. This is the evil core premise of the disreputable historical eugenics movement. The fact is that humans are imperfect in a whole host of ways. American physicist Freeman Dyson said, quote, "I cannot regard humanity as the final goal of God's creation. Humanity looks to me like a magnificent beginning, but not the last word." More directly, rocket engineer Bob Truax said, quote, "What right-minded engineer would try to build any machine out of lime and jelly? Bone and protoplasm are extremely poor structural materials." Mathematical physicist Frank Tipler wrote, quote, "Our species is an intermediate step in an infinitely long temporal chain of being that comprises the whole of life in space-time." And finally, author and philosopher Nick Bostrom writes, quote, "Far from being the smartest possible biological species, we're probably better thought of as the stupidest possible biological species capable of starting a technological civilization. A niche filled because we got there first, not because we're in any sense optimally adapted to it." If we say that modifying ourselves to address these and other imperfections is wrong, we're potentially sentencing ourselves to eons of needless suffering and imperfection, which would be unethical. Also, the human rights and equality perspective suggests that individuals and parents should be allowed to choose to use genetic engineering, and that it would be immoral to force millions of people to suffer diseases that could be avoided through genetic engineering. Of course, the ethics of applying genetic engineering to humans also depends on who is applying it to whom. A situation where a government or other group is enforcing their standards on individuals is far more ethically fraught than a situation where a person is deciding to apply it to themselves or their children under the direction of medical professionals. Many would argue that there are situations where the rights of the group should win out against the rights of the individual. For example, governments representing the best interests of their populations sometimes require their citizens to take medically proven vaccines under the premise that the benefit to society, including reduced death and suffering, outweigh the individual's right to refuse the vaccine and imperil the group. On the other hand, when the change is not the avoidance of a deadly disease, but a more substantial and elective change, especially those that limit versus protect or enhance current capabilities, the rights of the individual properly dominate. It's clearly a crime for a government to alter its citizens for reasons other than their overall health and benefit. Otherwise, this could lead directly to dystopias, similar to the Brave New World envisioned by Aldous Huxley, where different classes of people are bred with higher and lower levels of capabilities without their approval. The situation is less ethically fraught when an individual is deciding for themselves or their offspring, but it still depends on the specific application of genetic engineering. Perhaps the least ethically fraught situation is when an individual chooses to have their somatic or body cells reprogrammed. Since such changes die with the individual and do not propagate to future generations, the individual's liberty to make this decision might only be balanced by the medical certainty that such an intervention would be beneficial, which medical standards are designed to uphold. And of course, the relatively smaller issue of whether the change to the individual might have an impact on the broader society. More fraught would be a situation where a parent is choosing to apply genetic engineering to their children. But how could we reject a parent's ability to genetically engineer their children when we accept the rights of parents to benefit their children in literally every other way, including education, cosmetic surgery, fertility treatments and abortions, and prescriptions drugs even, such as Ritalin and Prozac? One step further would be to apply genetic engineering to germ cells, such as human sperm and eggs. As we discussed in our Applications of Genetic Engineering video, these changes can be passed on to future generations. Still, you might say that as long as the parent is making this decision on behalf of their children, this is in fact no different than sexual selection, where people choose mates with characteristics that will be passed on to future generations. The only difference might be the range of choices made. In mates, we ethically assess as many physical and mental traits as courtship will allow. But genetic engineering allows us to assess the potential for many other characteristics, such as genetic diseases, and select for sex, hair, and eye color and other factors today, and may soon allow for a selection of a much broader set of characteristics. We would argue that the fact that we can identify and positively select for more characteristics than sexual selection has allowed does not suddenly make parents' choosing unethical. Finally, not allowing individuals and parents to procreate and live as they choose has every bit as much impact on the human gene pool as allowing it. It unethically denies the rights of individuals and interferes with the evolution of humanity. As with the characteristics that should be selected by parents in IVF and PGD from our last video, the answer also depends on what traits are being edited. People appear to think that some uses of elective genetic engineering are more ethical than others. Most people would agree that using genetic engineering to cure diseases is not only ethical, but a great leap forward for humanity. However, studies show that fewer are comfortable with the notion that genetic engineering should be used for human enhancement. Note that unlike IVF and PGD, which we discussed in our last video, where only naturally occurring characteristics can be selected, genetic engineering could broaden this to include characteristics of other species or even entirely new characteristics, which might be ethically harder to support. One recent study found that while 72% of U.S. adults approved of changing a baby's genes to treat serious congenital diseases, 80% of U.S. adults said that changing a baby's genes to make them more intelligent would be, quote, taking medical technology too far. Since today this question can only be asked of those who have not been able to take advantage of intelligence-enhancing genetic engineering, it's probably not surprising that most would prefer not to be surpassed in the future by those who do. However, since parents today will do pretty much anything to give their children a good education and give them every advantage, we suspect that if you ask parents today whether they wanted such enhancements for their children, far fewer would consider enhancing their intelligence to be, quote, taking the medical technology too far. Also, there's no clear line between curing and enhancing. By curing diseases, you're clearly enhancing human life expectancy. As Yuval Noah Harari notes in Homo Deus, quote, healing is the initial justification for every upgrade. More subtly, research into improvements often leads to cures. As we saw in our genetic engineering video, CRISPR itself was inadvertently discovered out of an effort to improve yogurt's commercial properties. There are many similar examples. As a result, we think that such decisions should be made by those who actually have the choice, based on fact-based medical assessments of the benefits and the risks at that time. Views regarding human cloning have been strongly negative, which we find a bit surprising, since 4 out of every 1,000 human births are identical twins, who are genetic clones, and there's no question about whether their birth is ethical, or whether they are less worthy than singletons, or that they will somehow undermine humanity. Also, the demand for people wanting to clone themselves is so low that it's largely a red herring, often put forward by those wishing to engender resistance to genetic engineering. The technology serves life and doesn't stop perspective suggests that genetic engineering has extraordinary potential to serve humanity, for example by extending human life expectancy and even potentially curing aging, that it would be difficult or impossible to stop even if we wanted to. Recall that unlike nuclear technology, genetic engineering requires less expertise and uses materials that are much more widely available. On the positive side, genetic engineering was designed from the outset to benefit mankind versus nuclear bombs, which were clearly designed to kill. The imperative of responsibility and action perspective also suggests that we need to apply genetic engineering in a way that is mindful of those that cannot represent themselves, such as children and other species. Invoking the proportionality perspective suggests that, rationally, people should be comfortable with genetic engineering when the error rate becomes equal to or lower than the error rate associated with natural conception. For example, about 2% of people end up with anomalies, versus when it becomes perfect. And it appears that this standard will soon be reached. Multiple eminent geneticists and ethicists suggest that we should move forward with genetic engineering. CRISPR co-inventor Jennifer Doudna, in her March 19, 2015 article titled, quote, "A Prudent Path Forward for Genetic Engineering and Germline Gene Modification," offers 4 recommendations. First, create forums to allow interested members of the public to assess reliable information on gene editing technologies. Second, continue testing and developing CRISPR technology. Third, create an international meeting to ensure all relevant safety and ethical implications could be openly and transparently discussed. And fourth, a moratorium on making heritable changes to the human genome. Almost simultaneous articles in Nature, the MIT Technology Review, and governmental agencies said the same thing. On the other hand, we would argue that if it is safe and effective and its benefits outweigh its risks, why hold this therapy to a higher standard than any other medical treatment? James Watson, who shared the Nobel Prize with Crick for discovering the structure of DNA, wrote, quote, "Despite the risks, my view is that we should give serious consideration to gene-line therapy." And, quote, "I find the lag in embracing even the most unambiguous benefits to be utterly unconscionable." In 2015, the distinguished philosopher and bioethicist Julian Salvescu wrote that research should continue. Quote, "To intentionally refrain from engaging in life-saving research is to be morally responsible for the foreseeable, avoidable deaths of those that could be benefited." A month later, acclaimed Harvard scholar Steven Pinker stated even more strongly, quote, "The primary moral goal of today's bioethicists can be summarized in a single sentence: get out of the way." Whether or not you agree with these perspectives, we urge you to judge for yourself and contribute to these important conversations. We believe there's a strong ethical case for speeding technology development. More broadly, while there are clearly ethical issues that should cause us to pause, consider, and coordinate, the Dead Reckoning framework indicates that on balance, ethical considerations should accelerate, not slow, the advancement of life-enhancing technologies. Many things that we're doing now are profoundly unethical and will remain so until we and our technologies advance. We've shown that it's unethical to fail to save and extend human lives where we can. Multiple technologies have already contributed to more than doubling HLE and have the potential for enormous additional improvements. It would be highly unethical to fail to continue this progress if we have the choice. We have also shown in our New Ways to Die videos that the risks of new deaths from these new technologies is extremely small compared to the lives they could save. To slow these improvements is to sentence future generations to shorter lives and even death. The urgency with which we pursue these opportunities should be proportionate to this extraordinary opportunity. Perhaps anti-aging gerontologist Aubrey de Grey said it best in his 2005 TED Talk. He said, quote, "If we do not pursue the option to extend life expectancy, if we fail to explore the possibility of curing aging, we are then condemning a full cohort of people to an untimely death, and that is immoral. It is not right for us to decide this for future generations." Also, it is clearly not ethical to promote the survival of some humans over others, yet there seems to be an outbreak of me-first politics and actions across the globe. As long as individuals don't have what they need to survive, they will be driven, as all animals are, to do whatever they need to do to survive. Ethics be damned. Today, the cost of allowing people to suffer is simply become too high. We can't afford to trigger self-motivated and tribe-motivated behaviors and allow people to suffer. The only defensible ethical position must be that the human imperative is to help all those that are alive to live full, long, and healthy lives. That's why we at Human Life Expectancy Inc. make such a big deal of HIHUA, help yourself and help us all to live longer. Allowing technology to continue its trajectory of allowing us to meet the needs of more and more people should therefore be a top moral imperative. Our current production of food is also clearly unethical. It's not ethical to provide ourselves with food that causes us to die of coronary diseases, diabetes, cancer, and other avoidable diseases. It's also clearly not ethical to wreak untold suffering and death upon billions of sentient animals each year, and unethical to drive species to extinction by chopping down rainforests so that we can grow more cattle and livestock. Our strongest excuse for doing these awful things has been some combination of, it's what we need to survive, and it's how we evolved, so it's not our fault. But now, we not only have the technology to feed ourselves with vegetables, as we've had for centuries, we have new technologies for growing meat ourselves, potentially saving billions of animals and the environment in the process. Technology now offers the realistic prospect of denying both these excuses while improving our health. Our current carbon-based production of energy is also highly unethical. Destroying our planet for ourselves, the 8.7 million or so species that inhabit the Earth, and all future generations can in no way be considered ethical. New low-carbon energy alternatives, together with new technology for packaging and processing our garbage and waste, must proceed as an ethical priority. Continued technological advancement with appropriate ethical and regulatory guidelines will unquestionably allow us to do a better and better job of meeting the collective needs and realizing our collective aspirations over time. Arresting continued technological development, even if we could, would delay progress, causing countless unnecessary and untimely deaths, and doom us to the current unethical and unsustainable status quo. While some questions only impact individuals or groups and might only need to be made on those levels, those that impact all of humanity need to be made by all of us. Deciding how we and other species will evolve and aligning on ethical ways to make it happen clearly fall into this category. So how we choose to apply genetic engineering, or as we called it in our early videos, volitional evolution, properly belongs among other existential issues facing humanity, such as human population growth, climate change, pandemics, nuclear weapons, natural cataclysms, and global food supply transformation. This important issue must be resolved quickly and globally to ensure that mankind benefits maximally from the genetic engineering and related technologies. So, in summary, genetic engineering gives us great new power over animals and humans and how we will evolve, but raises important ethical issues about how we might use and provide equal access to this power. This requires that we continually challenge ourselves to make progress toward evolving, aligning on, and realizing core ethical perspectives. Under the evolution exists and doesn't stop perspective, we need to challenge ourselves. Are we falsely assuming that evolution either doesn't exist or will not continue? Are we mistakenly assuming that humans are the destined endpoint of all evolution? Under the human rights and equality perspective, is the difference between the haves and the have-nots of health, life expectancy, wealth, and other factors decreasing over time? Under the humans first perspective, are we continuing to question our existing dominion over all life? And are we appropriately weighing our intelligence and our capabilities versus other life forms? Under the living first perspective, are we considering and representing the rights of future generations? How are they to be balanced with the rights of the living? Under the imperative of responsibility perspective, are appropriate efforts underway to understand and respond to the needs of people and other species that cannot represent themselves? Under the technology serves humanity and doesn't stop perspective, is technology being used in humanity's best interests? And are we fooling ourselves that technological advance can be slowed or controlled? Under the proportion matters perspective, are we allocating scarce resources in proportion to their abilities to save or extend lives? For example, by using dollars per life year extended or some similar metric? We'll also need effective, representative regulations that balance the need to keep government out of people and science's way with the dangers of new technologies. That's the subject of our next video. In the meantime, please hit the like button below, subscribe to the Human Life Expectancy channel to make sure you don't miss our next videos, and post comments for the topics you'd like to have us cover. Thanks again for joining us. Till next time, as we say at Human Life Expectancy Inc., Hi Hua! Do what you can to help yourself and help us all to live longer.